So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kathryn O'Callaghan. I go by Katie. I'm from FDA Center for Devices and Radiologic Health. Brett mentioned some of the work we've done in the preference space. I also have the privilege and honor of overseeing our other science of patient input initiatives, including patient-reported outcomes and our patient engagement activities as well. And it's probably been one of the most rewarding but also challenging areas of work that I've had the opportunity to be involved in since my time at FDA. I want to mention before I dive into a case example that we do talk across the 3 medical product centers, CDRH, CDER, and CBER, and we took somewhat of a different approach in focusing on patient preferences relatively early on than, for example, CDER's PFDD focus, which looked at the context, what do we know about the disease, its impact on patients, alternatives, et cetera. At CDRH, we focused on the benefit-risk decision itself. At the time, we, like the other medical product centers, were looking at our decision framework for weighing the benefit and risk information. It's a very challenging part of our job. A lot of it involves apples and oranges and people with different expertise looking at the balance and saying, where is it? And we realized that we weren't thinking about what is the patient's perspective of that balance. And at the Center for Devices, we also have a lot of really challenging clinical trial design issues around what I call strategy trials. If you think of some of our biggest breakthrough technologies that fall under the medical device purview, they are going to be compared to medical therapy that's usually the patients are still refractory, it's suboptimal, it's not meeting their needs, open surgery, or a device-based, less invasive alternative. And so the clinical equipoise is artificial at best from the patient's perspective. And it's true that we don't know what all the benefits and risks are, but preferences about, maybe route of administration would be a good corollary here, is really a big deal for patients. So, really being able to think about this for our benefit risk decisions was a priority for CDRH. So I also am going to talk about a case example that we did not sponsor, and the goal for me here is to give you a sense of how it was applied and used in regulatory decisions. So Brett talked on the weight loss example. I will focus on at-home dialysis, where patient preference information was used to assess risk tolerance. There are a number of other studies ongoing. There's some information in the public domain about use of qualitative preference information for pediatric patients, for pediatric diabetic patients, and then some other ongoing studies that we hope will be in the public domain soon. So a little bit of background on the at-home dialysis case. End-stage renal disease has been a priority for FDA for a while, given the public health impact and unmet needs. And there had been some early engagement with the patient community and other stakeholders through the Kidney Health Initiative, which is a public-private partnership. This was in 2015. The treatment options are hemodialysis, which is the majority of patients, about 87% receive that, typically 3 times a week in clinic. There's also peritoneal dialysis and renal transplantation. Most of the patients who are receiving in-clinic hemodialysis, only about 2% receive at-home dialysis, deal with a lot of what we had been referring to as inconvenience factors, which we learned through the 2015 workshop. That's really is somewhat of a dismissive term from the patient perspective. This was having a significant long-term impact on their quality of life, such that it really did affect risk tolerance in a way that we maybe didn't appreciate. So the benefit-risk trade-off with at-home hemodialysis is that there's the potential for rare but serious adverse events, and there was a concern that without trained medical professionals there to deal with those situations, is that an acceptable benefit-risk trade-off? And so initially, home hemodialysis had been green-lighted with a risk mitigation in place that there is a requirement for the patient to have a care partner there with them at home. This, of course, made it impossible for patients who don't have a care partner there at home to have the benefits of at-home dialysis. So I'll touch on some details that are in the publicly available FDA decision summary document, which you can find on our website online. The study included existing home hemodialysis patients, 15% of whom were current users of the solo system for home hemodialysis. They were presented with benefit-risk profiles of in-center versus solo home hemodialysis and variable risks for death and needle dislodgement leading to serious injury, which were the two biggest adverse events of concern. Threshold technique questions were used to identify the risk tolerance threshold, in other words, where they would switch. And the 510K summary includes tables with the evidence from those studies showing the percentage of patients at different levels of risk. Two key points that I'll highlight from the results is that there was a heterogeneity of preferences. And one of the things that's very hard to do myself, I try to be consistent and I try to beat it into the brains of the folks on my team, is to not say patients want or patients said, because the whole point is that patients have different perspectives depending on their context and the preference. And so, I think we saw some heterogeneity there that was helpful and important for us to understand in our regulatory decision making. Patients who did prefer the solo home hemodialysis with a higher level of risk were more likely to be under 60 and non-diabetic. And essentially, there were a number of measures that got at this, but essentially they were more confident in their own abilities to handle those risks should they occur. And so many of them had more experience being there, involved in, and had been trained for a longer period of time. So, wow, yellow already. So we ultimately, FDA green-lighted a change in their indications for use and removed that specific reference to that risk mitigation as a requirement. Transferable lessons learned, early engagement with the FDA was really important because of this being intended for regulatory use. This here is a framework that we put together with CEDAR and CBER and was highlighted at a December workshop on patient preferences. Many of you in the room here were there. I think a key point that maybe is obvious to everyone here, I'm sorry, that's a bit difficult to read, but it is really a key and common challenge whenever we engage the broader research community, is that the strength of the evidence is going to differ depending on its use. And so when you're doing research on earlier context setting cases, you may not have to address the same kinds of questions as we will need to be looking at very carefully for regulatory evaluation. Here's just a snapshot of some of the content that we touched on at our December workshop. Looking at patient preferences, starting with awareness, understanding, and adoption. While there's over 100,000 hits on patient preferences in PubMed, I think it's fair to say we're still early days in terms of its use for regulatory applications. We're still seeing modest willingness to try on the part of sponsors to bring this into FDA. And I think people are at different places along this, this ladder towards adoption. I think where there are needs is, in the why do a study, starting with the use, beginning with the end in mind, and then thinking about what methods you need and what strength of evidence is going to be needed to be convincing to the decision maker. And then in the adoption space, the research agenda ought to touch on some of the things that were discussed at that workshop. I think this is a philosophical point, and then I'll end there. I think we may have a philosophical difference of opinion whether, we should go for covering the waterfront or honing in on a couple of higher priority areas. To me, because there's such a limited capacity for preference researchers who can work in the health space, in the benefit risk decision context, and in a regulatory application arena, we ought to channel these resources where it's really going to be most impactful. And so I think the sweet spot is sort of the middle of the Venn diagram of three circles where we have preference-sensitive patient decisions, The preferences are about things that are relevant to regulatory decision makers and to product developers, and where we understand at least enough about the patient perspectives on the disease and the characteristics of the option to put together a preference research that's informative. And we're all here for the shared goal of improving patient health. I think we also need to think about how to leverage from sister sciences like patient-reported outcomes. Everyone says this. I think the challenge is that as expert scientists, we may not be the best suited to connect the dots across those silos. And so a roadmap for how to do that, I think, would go a long way. So I'll stop there.
We're wonderfully done. Thank you, Katie. And we only had 3 speakers this round, so we can be a little more flexible on the time. Questions for Katie? Robert. Identify yourself for the
Robert
transcription.
McBurney from the Accelerated Cure Project for Multiple Sclerosis. You raised a very important point, which was that one patient usually speaks for themselves, not for the community. What attempts did you make to parse the preference by the characteristics of the person?
I think you're asking about whether clinical characteristics and preferences are correlated in a way that affected our decision, or is that about right?
About right, yes.
Yeah, that's really a challenge. I think people who do preference research in non-health context will tell you that there are a lot of variables that we couldn't really act upon in a medical context that are correlated with differences in preferences and choice. What we looked for were things that were either things that you could identify in a clinical context with a mindset of sort of patient population subgrouping, if you will, or that had to do with, in the solo case, risk mitigation, right? Ability to deal with that risk isn't something we had the information to look at differently until this study was done.
All right. John and Kevin, and then we'll have time. Was there anyone else in the queue that I missed? Thank you.
John Bridges, let me get it right. Ohio State University. Sorry, I'm going to get... Katie, thank you very much for this overview. We can see this evolving. I still think that we've heard a few things today where we might have to broaden our definition of preference sensitive. So I can think of an area where all people think the same way, but yet the outcomes that we measured are not consistent with that. I take the example of schizophrenia. Having done more than a dozen studies on schizophrenia, I know that we're not measuring the right outcome. People are very consistent in saying what the outcome should be. It's not that they have different preferences, it's their preferences differ from what the assumptions about preferences are. So maybe just thinking about broadening other scenarios that it's not just that people have different preferences, that the preferences might be different from what clinicians think, what policymakers think. We've heard a couple of examples in the room about that today.
All right, excellent, John. Thank you. And Kevin, did you have your card up? No. Okay.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Very good. Mary, and please identify yourself.
Mary Tobin, Acres. This almost goes back to the very first session as well. I think that, trying to think how to phrase this, in social sciences, whether it's mediation theory, conflict resolution, cultural anthropology, we kind of use a phrase, the story is never the story. And that kind of encapsulates that sometimes people on their own have to be asked questions in such a way that you start to draw things out that they haven't brought to their conscious ability to articulate. and that they frequently do this better in a group, because then my idea gets sparked because Ken has said something and I go, oh, and then Brea said something.
Well, now I know why we designed the thing today.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, thank you.
And so it seems to me that one of the, I guess I would call it a gap, is that we need to think about how is it that we best get information, not just from the patient stakeholders, but from all of the stakeholders, in such a way that we start to bring up what anthropologists call covert information, the kind of hidden information. And if you don't get that out, then it remains a challenge and a barrier that you can't solve because it's never been articulated. And so somehow, I don't know exactly where that fits in here, but I just have a feeling that that's going to be critical.
Katie, do you have thoughts on that? Sounds both exciting and very important, but also subject to how is it rigorous and could it ever meet a regulatory
True, although
standard?
I would argue that maybe some of that work happens in the earlier end of the spectrum that I presented, where, you know, the insight is the most valuable thing. It's not that it needs to meet the statutory definition of valid scientific evidence. But I do think that some of the qualitative work that's being done does get at some of those things. Yeah.
Joey will give you a comment, and then Marilyn will get final word.
Joey Mattingly, University of Maryland. Just a quick question, and maybe I was thinking about your equation and getting to a patient-centric healthcare, and I think about like just the overall history of the FDA and where we've kind of come along. Where do you think unintended consequences of moving to a patient-centric healthcare play in where we're going? Because I don't know if, like, I would argue that we've gotten a much more clinically effective healthcare as, you know, Kefauver-Harris was passed, and as and Hatch-Waxman, and go down the line, we've got more effective care today. But I don't know if we've addressed some of the unintended consequences, and maybe it's related to cost or affordability or other areas. So where do you think that fits into this whole paradigm, like the unintended consequences of what we do to get to patient-centric?
That's way above my pay grade. But I do think, you know, some of the things that don't come into FDA that look at cost and how that plays into patient, not just preferences, but access ultimately are certainly big questions that you know, the agency and other parties in the ecosystem are trying to deal with. You know, I think unintended consequences as a regulator is something that we sort of have in our DNA is sort of a sixth sense for looking out for those kinds of things. You know, we have trained skeptics as our bread and butter reviewers, and they are looking very closely for those kinds of things.
Excellent. Marilyn, final comment.
Thank you. Marilyn Metcalf, GSK. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on some of the discussion about covert information and unintended consequences and some of those more difficult methodologies. I think going back to some of the earlier discussion about there are things that are the right thing to do, like pursuing these. But I think we're just beginning to scratch the surface around how to do some of those. So I take the point that there's a lot of social science research around motivations and a lot of things we don't capture clinically. I think it's about time we tried to start looking at some collaborations on how to do some of that. So I appreciate the openness to being able to think more deeply about that, because there is a lot of social context to what's happening in the clinic. And so I encourage us to pursue that as part of our research agenda.
Excellent. Wonderful. Katie, thank you so much. You did a great job. Wonderful.